I am nice, but I'm awful crucial with these hands.
If you were like me, you spent a solid chunk of the last decade watching the career of Joe Calzaghe inside the ring. In terms of delivering drama, that career seldom disappointed. If you didn't get the chance to follow that 15-year career, you missed out on something special. Joe amassed an astonishing 21 successful title defenses at super middleweight before winning his second championship at light heavyweight. He retired unbeaten at 46-0 with 32 knockouts, as well as 24 total wins in championship fights. He also accomplished all of that with one of the worst cases of bad hands in the modern era. Despite a years-long epidemic of broken bones, sprained knuckles, busted wrists, and various dislocations, Calzaghe clearly set himself apart from the crowd. Here's to the essential 8 wins of the fighter who fans used to affectionately call China Hand Joe. Joe was criticized by American fans for years because these fans believed that he was just a protected European champion feasting on hapless mandatory challengers lined up by the WBO. The Pride of Wales eventually buried that criticism forever when he made his American debut against Bernard Hopkins. The fight was made even more high stakes by this colorful bit of trash talk by Hopkins.
I'll never let a white boy beat me. You can call it any statement you want. Anybody can print that. I will never lose to a white person.
Hopkins, even in his 40s, was a daunting challenge. Just ask Antonio Tarver and Winky Wright, 2 pound-for-pound level fighters who had been recently humiliated by Hopkins inside the ring. The executioner had alternatively decapitated and decisioned 20 consecutive challengers at middleweight before moving up to light heavyweight for those fights with Tarver and Wright. There was no doubt about it. Hopkins was a historical great. Rising from the canvas in the first round, Joe eventually claimed a hotly debated decision. His cardio and work rate proved to be the difference in this fight. This win could have rated higher given the stature of Hopkins, but the fight was ultimately foul-filled. Richie Woodhall was an outstanding British fighter, winning an Olympic silver medal as well as the WBC title against the excellent Sugar Boy Malinga. He defended that title twice, and before his title reign, he owned a really solid win over Silvio Branco. Calzaghe was aggressive from the beginning of this fight. He was moving in and out on angles, and he made good use of his hand speed with a lot of southpaw blitzes. Meanwhile, Woodhall looked better than he ever had before. I think Woodhall knew he was kind of nearing the end of his career, and he wanted to prove himself against the new talent on the block, so to speak. He was focused, and he executed a disciplined game plan. He was landing his right hand almost at will throughout the early rounds of the fight. But during the middle rounds, Calzaghe really began to turn the tide of the fight in his favor, making expert use of his right hook to the body, particularly along the ropes. As Woodhall wilted from the pace and the body attack, Calzaghe only accelerated. After dropping Woodhall hard in the 9th round, Calzaghe came out for the kill and got the stoppage early in round 10. This victory played a major role in legitimizing Calzaghe as a genuine world-class fighter. Joe came into his fight with Omar Sheikha in the middle of a bit of a slump professionally. After a great start to his title reign, in 1999 he encountered a particularly rough stretch of injuries, and those injuries bled into his performances inside the ring. First, he struggled during a split decision win over Robin Reed. No shame in that, given that Reed was a former champion and an outstanding talent in his own right. But when Joe next had a pair of sluggish 12-round wins over Rick Thornberry and David Starry, the British boxing fans began to wonder if their next new star had been overvalued. Joe came into his fight with the Palestinian-American Sheikh in need of a big win to convince the fans of his stature. He was also angling for a showdown with Roy Jones Jr. Looking focused, he showed greatly improved defense, and by the third round he was really dialed in and was starting to dominate the fight. Boxing behind his rhythmic southpaw jab, Calzaghe punished Sheikh with counter left hands whenever Sheikh got close, and in the fifth round he slashed Sheikh's face open with some strafing punches. Referee Gino Rodriguez stopped the fight in the fifth, with Sheikh covering up along the ropes. For years, Calzaghe had yearned to earn a meeting with Roy Jones Jr. in order to prove his place among the elite of boxing. Here, in 2008, he finally got that wish. But unfortunately for Calzaghe, for Jones, and for the fans themselves, this wasn't quite the dreamed-of super fight. Jones was no longer the fighter of the decade, the once-in-a-lifetime talent who had carved up the middleweight and super middleweight divisions before becoming only the second man in history to hold the heavyweight title while concurrently reigning as the light heavyweight champion. He'd lost a pair of fights to his Florida rival Antonio Tarver, as well as a devastating knockout loss to Glenn Johnson that seemed to permanently signal Jones's exodus from the elite class of boxing. In truth, Calzaghe wasn't the same force of yesteryear either. His age and his history of injuries was visibly beginning to catch up with him. Still, Calzaghe was the lineal champ at 175 pounds, while Jones Jr. had managed to rehabilitate his image to some degree, winning 3 consecutive fights, capped by beating Tito Trinidad. The fight turned out to be a lot better than expected. Joe rose from a first-round knockdown to dominate the remainder of the bout. After slicing Jones's face open and battering him badly down the stretch, it was expected that Calzaghe would capitalize on the unanimous decision win by moving on to more mega fights against guys like Chad Dawson, Jean Pascal, or Carl Froch. The fight between Calzaghe and Eubank was a meeting of the old generation and the new generation. Going in, Calzaghe boasted a gorgeous 22-0 record with 21 wins by knockout. But the Welshman was undeniably green. Meanwhile, Eubank was one of the greatest stars in the history of British boxing. He had enjoyed 2 lengthy title reigns as champion at both 160 and 168 pounds. But by this point, he was past his best years. This fight was expected to provide a lot of clarity on the status of both fighters moving forward. Calzaghe dropped Eubank in the opening seconds of the fight and wasted nearly all of his energy in his follow-up attack. After almost punching himself out in the first 90 seconds of his title shot, he then had to endure a series of withering counterattacks throughout the remainder of the fight. Joe ultimately won the fight by a wide margin on the scorecards, but Eubank made him fight for each stanza. Calzaghe would later insist that this was the toughest fight of his entire career. As previously mentioned, Calzaghe spent a large chunk of his career fighting against the perception that he was just another protected European champion who was afraid to fight quality opponents or venture outside the safety of the UK. This fight with Mitchell was a critical part in changing that perception as the years went by. Mitchell was a former American Golden Gloves champ as an amateur, and as a professional he had a big KO win over Frankie Lyles on his record. He also had a pair of wins over Manny Siaka and another win over Julio Cesar Green. Those wins over Siaka and Green were for the WBA super middleweight title. In this fight, Calzaghe showed new facets to his game, mixing his characteristic southpaw blitzes from the outside with some impressive comfort fighting while in the pocket. Knifing left hands to the breadbasket and counter right hooks to the head helped him win the first round by a mile. In the second round, Calzaghe continued his good work, rocking Mitchell with some more flurries. But shockingly, Mitchell was able to floor Calzaghe with a counter right hand about halfway through the round. Calzaghe decided to fight fire with fire, even though he was clearly wobbled. The two swung for the fences before Calzaghe sent Mitchell sprawling into the ropes with an overhand left of his own. After that mandatory 8 count, Calzaghe forced referee Dave Paris to halt the fight with a conclusive flurry of power punches along the ropes. Joe was trained for the entirety of his career by his father Enzo. Enzo was a bit of a boxing novice, but an expert jazz musician. And the influence of Enzo's jazz background on Joe's style had always been apparent, and Joe was in a special groove on this night in 2006. Despite the fact that he was sporting an injured left hand, he fought like he was possessed by the ghost of John Coltrane, using beautiful syncopation and improvisation to demolish the heavily hyped American Olympian. Joe won multiple rounds by a 10-8 margin with his dominance before netting a legit knockdown late in the fight. Such was his dominance that Lacey's only real bright spot in the entire fight was when Joe was docked a point for holding behind the head. Kessler was far more proven than Lacey ever was. He had strong wins over Manny Siaka and Anthony Mundine. He had a number of successful title defenses against guys like Eric Lucas and Liberato Andrade. Kessler had a much more varied game than Lacey, and early on in the fight, he gave Calzaghe a lot of difficulty with his variety and his solid defense. Calzaghe and Kessler more or less traded the early rounds of the fight, with Calzaghe sometimes using his southpaw blitzes to win the key exchanges, while other times Kessler dictated the pace of the fight from long range and really buzzed Calzaghe with some straight right hands and some uppercuts in the middle of the ring. Just like in the Woodall fight, Calzaghe turned the tide with a series of body punches in the middle rounds. As the fight went deeper, Calzaghe increasingly poured on the pressure, and by the championship rounds, it looked like the Welshman could have scored a stoppage if he had really hit the gas. Instead, he cruised to a wide unanimous decision in a really entertaining fight, and in the aftermath of that decision, he was more or less crowned the greatest super middleweight of all time.